areas in India when it comes to climate. Can we all agree? And
Absolutely.
Also with the, again, if we're going to be talking about terroir as it associates to wine, but we can also understand it just by the different cities that we have in India. For example, Jaipur is almost like the desert. It's flat for the most part, very dry, where Bangalore is a lot cooler. Elevation's a little higher, a little more lush, a little more tropical down there with the climate. So that's what we're going to discover about the different wine regions, how they differ. And it's the same concept as how Bangalore differs from Jaipur. So it's all about that. So yeah, so we're going to talk because Peter gave us the session and we kind of did an overview of all of the different things we're going to be learning. And I always like to start when we start talking about wine is starting in the vineyard, because that's where it all starts. Wine is basically a fermented beverage from grape juice. If we kind of look at the basic definition of what wine is a drink made from the fermented juice of freshly picked grapes. That's all it is. It's not that complicated, but wine can be dramatically different in color, flavor, aroma, feel in the mouth, depending on grape variety, but also depending on where the grapes are grown. And we're going to talk about that. But before we can understand the effects of terroir, we have to understand what's being affected. And wine, again, we have these freshly picked grapes, we squeeze them, we have the juice, and then we have fermentation. And that's basically where the yeast starts to eat all of the sugars. And the sugars produce alcohol, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of heat. I always like to take it to my very simple equation. S plus Y equals alcohol, CO2. S is sugar, Y is yeast. And it's that yeast, because yeast is actually a living, breathing organism. It's alive and it gets hungry and it likes to eat sugar, just like most of you people, yeah? Especially, well, there's no Bengalis here because I guess we're doing Jaipur the other. But again, my sons are from Bengal and they love to have sweets. But I want to talk about first, where does this sugar come from? Okay. But without this sugar, we're not going to be able to have wine. We're not going to be able to have fermentation. But where exactly does the sugar come from? A lot of people think that the sugar is coming from the grapes, when in fact, the grapes are really just the storage tanks for the sugar. If we look at the plant, if we look at the grape plant, the vine has leaves and stems and shoots and stalks, has the bunches of grapes on it. The sugar is created in the leaf. And then it's transferred through the stalks and the stems into the grapes. And the grapes are these storage tanks. So it's created in the leaf, but and again, one of the great interesting things about terroir is how that affects the grape growing, because the leaf is really just the mechanism. What causes the production of sugar is actually sunlight. Sunlight hits the leaf, and the leaf is green because it's full of chlorophyll. And it's in the leaf that the sunlight then creates this conversion. So we get this conversion of sunlight, chlorophyll, or carbon dioxide from the air, and we create our sugar. So those of you who remember your biology classes in high school, chemistry, I hated biology. Hated chemistry. I was most likely bunking these classes, and I was at the park with my friends and we were drinking beer. So But now I kind of like it. I kind of like the concept of chemistry and biology, because as it relates to wine, it's something that I can relate to. So let's talk about this production of sugar in the leaf. As the plant comes to life in the vineyard, in the early spring, it starts to shoot out its sprouts, its leaves. The leaves start to open, the vines start to grow, and then we start to get the little flowers. And then the flowers will turn into little tiny green berries. And then as the grape ripens, these berries get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start to turn from green to golden color if it's a white grape, or to a red or a purple if it's a black grape. And this is all happening as the vine matures. So a fully ripened grape typically is about 80% water, 20% sugars, and about 1% PC. And PC stands for phenolic compound. Or to put it into a more simple term, that 1% is the things that make grapes taste like grapes. Mangoes also have, about this similar percentages of water and sugar, and they also have phenolic compounds. But the phenolic compounds in mangoes are the things that make mangoes taste like mangoes. Okay, so as our grape ripens, as all of the sunlight hits these leaves, photosynthesis occurs, sugar is created, and is transformed into the grapes. And again, if you can imagine, the vine is actually kind of an interesting machine, because it has different components. It has the leaves for the photosynthesis, the grapes for the storage, and then it has this incredible root system that goes down 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 or more feet in order to pull up water and to pull up nutrient. And it's kind of like if you can imagine, like a pump. And it's this sunlight that hits the leaf is also giving the energy to the plant, and the pump starts to work. Sunlight starting, the pump is starting to work. We're creating the sugar. The pump is now pulling up from the root system water, which is required for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires a few things. Number one is sunlight. 2 is water, a little bit of water. Grapes are kind of funny. They actually just need a little bit of water in order to live. They really don't like too much water. In fact, my sommelier teacher back at George Brown, he has an expression that said, grapes don't like wet feet. So they don't like a lot of water. So when we talk about terroir, we're going to be talking about what aspects of the vineyard do we want, what is the best aspect of a vineyard, how much sunlight it gets, how much water it gets, what kind of soil it is. And we're going to look at what are the best attributes of that. But the plant pulls up the water, the nutrients, photosynthesis occurs, and then we take that sugar and we store it into the grapes. And it takes, a few months for the grapes to go from flowers to like a perfectly ripe grape. But again, a perfectly ripe grape, 80, 20, and 1, okay? 101%, not exactly perfect, but again, I was probably skipping math class as well, so my mathematics are not so great, but I think you guys get the idea, yeah? So, and again, these phenolic compounds are important because just like mangoes taste like mangoes, do all mangoes taste the same? No, there's different species. There's different varieties of mangoes. And there's also different varieties of grapes. So all grapes are basically going to be slightly different in the flavor components they have, just like mangoes taste slightly different from each other. They look different, taste different, smell different. So that's what they have. But they all have these. All plants are going to have phenolic compounds. Tomatoes have phenolic compounds. And it's the things that make the tomatoes taste like tomatoes. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. So viticulture, very, very important, because viticulture is basically this science of growing grapes. It's a scientific study of grapes, focusing on growing grapes and producing grapes. When grapes are being used scientifically for wine production, the study of grapes is also known as viticulture, although we often associate viticulture with growing grapes and viniculture with making wine. So we're going to focus today more on what it takes to grow the grapes correctly so that we can have quality grapes, because quality grapes, we need to have quality wine. It's very, very important that we do that. And anyone that is in the wine business, anyone that is making wine, involved in making wine, we all agree on one thing, that quality wine is made in the vineyard. So it's very important to understand what makes a quality vineyard. What aspects does a vineyard need to have in order for it to make great grapes? And then again, once you've grown these great grapes, we hand them off to the winemaker, and hopefully he does everything correctly, and we will now have a great wine. But you cannot make great wine without great grapes. You can make bad wine with great grapes by having a bad winemaker, but hopefully that's not what's going to happen. So let's think about it. We want to make great wine. We need to grow great grapes. What does that mean? What does our vineyard need to have to grow great grapes? And again, thinking about the aspects of Jaipur, the soil of Jaipur, the terrain of Jaipur, the amount of sunlight, the amount of rain that Jaipur gets, different to Bangalore. And again, we grow grapes and make wine in Bangalore. You will never, ever be able to grow grapes and make wine in Jaipur. Although I do think in one of the palaces in Jaipur, there is a grapevine there. It's supposed to be a very, very old grapevine. I think it's in Jaipur. But you can certainly grow grapes anywhere. But you need to have certain aspects of a vineyard in order to grow great grapes. So that's what we want to focus on. And again, we can grow great grapes in Bangalore. We cannot grow great grapes in Jaipur. It's too hot. It's extremely dry. Again, grapes don't like a lot of water, but they need some. Jaipur can be quite dry, with exception, obviously, in the monsoon. So let's look at the world map, and let's look at what areas of the world can we grow quality grapes in order to be able to make wine. So let's look at our world in the map. And typically between 30 degrees and 50 degrees latitude in the Northern Hemisphere, and 30 to 50, sorry, in the Northern Hemisphere. This is kind of what we call the happy place. This is the happy place for grapes, for making wine. What's different between 30 and 50 degrees? Then as we get closer to the equator, as we get closer to the equator, it just gets hotter. And grapes like heat, grapes like warmth, but they don't like too much heat. If grapes get too much heat, they don't function as well. Extreme heat, they actually shut down. They don't do any photosynthesis. So you can't, in an area where you're growing grapes, you won't get any grapes growing if it's too hot, because the grape is just the vine is trying to preserve itself. So it shuts down all function and just focuses on staying alive. So we can't have the excessive heat that we have in the center part of the equator, basically from the equator to 30 degrees north and south. And if we look beyond 50 degrees in the north and the south, it gets too cool. We're not able to get the heat. but more importantly, the hours of sunlight in the northern and southern hemisphere as we get towards the poles becomes less and less and less. And grapes need a significant amount of sunlight to be able to do the photosynthesis. Without the photosynthesis, over an extended period of time, typically about 3 months for the ripeness, you're not going to get that perfectly ripe grape. You're not going to get that 80%, 21%. So these areas, not enough sunlight, not enough warmth, too hot for producing quality grapes. And again, you can grow grapes where it's hot, but what happens is grapes like to get to that nice 80-21, grapes like to ripen slowly. They like to have a very consistent, very warm days, and they actually like it a little bit cool at night. So nice heat, consistently, not too hot, not too cold. And then we start to get the elevation of sugar and the elevation of these phenolic compounds, the things that make the grapes taste like grapes. If you're growing grapes in a very hot climate, and this is a problem we have, even though we can make nice wine in India, we can't make great wine because it gets too hot. What happens with the sugar level and the phenolic level is if it's too hot, sugar levels will rise fast and the flavors won't get there though. So we end up with sort of a very high level of sugar in the grapes, but the complexity of the grapes, the nice complex flavors that we get with these phenolic compounds, they're not there. So we tend to have a high alcohol, very simple wine. So again, not too hot, not too cold, enough sunshine, but not too hot. But you'll see, even within this range of this 30 to 50 degrees, we're able to do quality grapes in each of these areas, but we have to find the right terroir in order for this to work. So let's talk about what that means. What is terroir? It's kind of a word we like to use in the wine business. It's kind of the catch-all word for everything that affects the vineyard. What makes a particular area of the world unique? Again, let's look at Jaipur. What makes Jaipur unique? Lots and lots of sunshine, lots and lots of heat. Soil is quite dry. It is quite flat. Jaipur, if I remember correctly, is quite flat. So that's kind of unique to that. If we look at Darjeeling, for example, Darjeeling elevation is quite a bit higher. Lots of mountains. It's obviously a lot cooler, and there's a little bit more rain and humidity up there. So these are the different aspects of terroir. Climate, the type of terrain, is it mountains, hills, is there lakes, is there rivers? Soil, what kind of soil? Is it black earth that's very fertile, which is great for growing tomatoes and vegetables, not great for growing grapes. Grapes actually are kind of funny. A grape will produce a better quality, a vine will produce a better quality grape if it actually has to struggle. The more that it has to really struggle to pull water up from its root system, the more it has to struggle to get a little bit of nutrient out of the soil, it actually produces better quality grapes, which then give us better quality wine. So climate, terrain, soil, tradition. If we look at climate a little more closely, you'll see it's the cold and the hot, wind, and fog. So let's look at different kinds of climate and how that affects the vineyard. So in climate, this is probably the single most important aspect of terroir that gives grapes their flavor and their character and their quality. Grapes require about 1,300 to 1,500 hours of sunlight while they're growing. So that growing season, sort of from spring until fall. And they require about 27 inches of rain the entire year. I know in India, we can get that in a month. That's a lot of rain. So that's actually, if you think about it, it's not so much. And actually, the grapevine, this rain, it prefers if it comes in the spring and in the winter. Grapes don't like to have rain when they are producing the grapes. They actually like very little rain when they're producing the grapes because these grapevines are really, really good at pulling water out of the soil, that when it does rain and they do have a fair amount of water, the vine will actually suck all this water up into the grapes. And what happens is, instead of getting, with our perfectly ripe grapes, 80% water, 20% sugar, and 1% of phenolic compounds or the flavors, it gets way more water. So we're now looking at about 90% water. So if you can imagine doing a, you know, the flavor packet, the drinks, like a cherry drink, and you get the flavor packets, you know, the powder, you put the powder into the jug and you're supposed to fill it up with X amount of water. And if you put the right amount of water in, let's say 80%, then you have a nice flavor of this cherry drink. But if you were to add twice as much water to that flavor packet, what's it going to taste like? Is it going to taste nice and cherry flavored? No, it's going to start to taste a little bit thin, a little bit not very interesting, because it's too diluted. There's too much water. And grapes are the same way. So when it's harvest time, we don't want any additional rains. And they always talk about, oh, we picked before the rains, because they don't want the rain to come, because it dilutes all of these nice concentrated flavors that you have. And again, think about that powdered drink that you put in. I used to, as a kid, with Kool-Aid. It was like cherry Kool-Aid we had. You put the packet in, you fill it up the amount of water, and it tastes good. Double the water, or even a little bit more, and it just tastes less interesting, not as flavorful. So grapes are kind of the same way. So that's why climate and water is very, very important. But the water should happen at the right time. Again, photosynthesis, it's like a machine. The vine is using the sunlight for energy, and it starts to pump. And what happens is the pump starts to pull up the water and the minerals from the roots. It activates the production of sugar, and then it pumps the sugars and the water into the grapes, and we produce that. So very, very important. Depending on the climate, when we're growing grapes, there's certain things that we can do to either maximize sunlight, minimize, or give a little bit of water if we need to. For example, if it's very, very, very dry. And again, the grapes don't need a lot of water, but they do need some water in order for photosynthesis to occur. Sometimes they have to do some irrigation. If it's really, really dry, then they're going to irrigate. If there's too much rain, there's really not that much we can do. But how to make sure that the vines don't get too much water is basically, let's choose where we plant them. And that's where we start to look at terrain. So terrain becomes very important in our vineyard. If we're in an area where they get a fair amount of rain, maybe we want to plant our vines on a slope. Because if it's raining, what happens to the rain? It goes away. Again, grapes don't like wet feet. We don't want to give it too much water. Altitude is increasingly more important now. Again, Jaipur, Darjeeling. Darjeeling, very, very high in altitude. It's significantly cooler because of that. So in areas of the world that are maybe still within those 30, 50 bands, but it's getting too warm, we need to plant grapes higher elevation. In Nasik, a little bit higher than in Jaipur. Elevation's a little higher. It's a little cooler in Nasik because of that. And as we find with global warming, we're starting to see traditional areas. For example, in Spain, they would plant the vines on the hills because they wanted that elevation, slope for the rain would come off. But now they're finding it's getting too hot with global warming. So they're starting to plant the vines higher and higher and higher up the hills and up the mountains to be able to keep that temperature cooler. Again, grapes like warmth, but they don't like too much heat. So we have to be very careful of that. South-facing slopes, preferably in the northern hemisphere, especially as we get up higher in more north in, say, France. For example, we're going to talk a little bit today about the grape Chardonnay grown in two different kinds of terroir. One is Burgundy. And Burgundy is in France, and Burgundy is actually quite high up in latitude. It's about, I would say, 45, 47 degrees latitude. So it's quite far north. And we're going to compare it to a California Chardonnay from Napa, and California is down here. So there's about a 15-degree difference between Burgundy and Napa Valley. We're growing the same grape variety, Chardonnay, in both of these places, but the wines are dramatically different in their flavor. And we're going to talk about that near the end. But in the northern hemisphere, all of these vineyards that run across the northern part of France, there isn't as much days of sunlight as they would like to have. Because the further north you go, less hours of sunlight. And it's a little bit cooler because of that. So in order to maximize sunlight in a vineyard that is more north, we need to, again, south-facing slopes are really, really good for that, because a south-facing slope is going to get maximum amount of sunlight. It gets the very, very early sunrise, and it gets the late day sun as well. If it's a north-facing slope, it's not getting any of that morning sun. All of that morning sun is coming up here. It's not even on the vineyard yet. But the south-facing slope gets it right from the very beginning. So again, we need to maximize the hours of sunlight that these vineyards get, because sunlight equals photosynthesis, equals production of sugar, production of phenolic compounds, and gives us those ripe grapes. So sunlight is the key to making quality wine. We have to maximize it in certain vineyards, minimize it in others, and we'll talk about those. So slopes are great for the maximizing of the sunlight. Slopes are also really good for getting rid of that excess water, that too much rain that comes, it just goes away. So south-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere, north-facing slopes in the southern hemisphere. Mountains are important. Again, if we're in an area where it's very hot, if we have mountains, that gives us elevation, gives the vineyard a little bit more cool to get, again, quality grapes, warmth, but not hot, hot, hot. Valleys, there's a lot of, in the wine growing areas around the world, a lot of them are valleys. The Rhone, for example, is the Rhone Valley, and it's got slopes on both sides, all the way down, because slopes give us those natural, the valleys give us natural slopes, water runs away, and again, if it's facing the right way, a south-facing slope is going to give us more sunlight. Being located far inland, if you are a coastal vineyard in the more north, it's quite cold. So a coastal vineyard is going to be too cool, but if we go inland, it's going to be a little warmer. On the other side of that, for example, Australia is an area where it's quite hot. But we get quality grapes in Australia in two places: along the coast of Australia and inland Australia if it starts to go up on the hills, on the mountains. So we have elevation inland, gives us a cooler area, or along the coast, we're getting the breezes that come in that keep the vineyards cooler. South Africa is another good example. South Africa is actually, if we look at it on our map, South Africa here is just barely within the band. It's quite close to the equator, but because South Africa is here, the best quality grapes happen on the coast, because the ocean that is around the bottom of South Africa is quite cold because it's near the Antarctic. So we're getting these nice cool breezes that actually keep that area cooler. But if you go inland in South Africa, it's hot. So you do get production of wine there, but the quality is very, very low. So again, South Africa, coastal's better. Australia, coastal's better. For example, northern France, you want to get away from the ocean. You want to go inland where it's warmer. Same with California, San Francisco. It's quite cool. The ocean beside San Francisco is quite cool. But as you go inland with San Francisco, you get into the Napa Valley, it gets quite warm. And that's kind of where we like to be. Large bodies of water. Again, the oceans for the cooling breezes. But we also have to think, if we're in northern France, the Champagne region, for example, or in Canada is another good example. Canada is actually quite far north as far as their wine growing regions, but there's a very, very good area to grow grapes, which is in Niagara, and Niagara is very near the Great Lakes there. So if we've got in Canada, a lot of the best vines are on those south-facing slopes, and if you can imagine a south-facing slope with a big lake in front of it, keeping in mind sunlight is needed for these vines to be able to ripen the grapes. So we have the direct sunlight that's coming into the vineyard because it's a south-facing slope, it's getting it all day. But then think of the lake in front of the vineyard as a mirror. What happens is the sunlight hits the lake and then bounces into the vineyard. So we're getting light directly into the vineyard from the sun, but also the sun reflecting into the lake. So vineyards that are around lakes, slopes around lakes, are getting much more sunlight than if it was at a flat area with no water bodies to be able to reflect the light. So large bodies of water, we have cooling effects in vineyards maybe that were too warm. We get refraction of sunlight into the vineyards to increase photosynthesis, increase the ripening of the grapes. So these are all aspects of the terroir in the vineyard that we get, that we really need in order to be able to produce quality grapes. Soil. So grapes, as I said, are kind of funny. They like to struggle. Grapes actually prefer soil that is not very nutrient rich. That black, brown, rich soil that we use for growing vegetables, this is not where you will find grapes growing. Grapes like low nutrient soil. So again, these slopes, these hills, on rocks, on gravel, on granite, this is what grapes like. They like to struggle. The more they struggle, the better the quality the grapes are going to have. But the soil should be healthy. The soil should have good aeration. It shouldn't be hard, packed soil. That's not a healthy soil. It needs to have aeration. And there's a lot of focus that goes into organic and biodynamic, which we'll get into later, that actually focus on making the soil healthy, not adding nutrient, just making it healthy, making it a loose soil with lots of aeration. Very, very important in that. Again, loose texture and good drainage. Gravel and sand are great because when it rains, the water goes right through the gravel, goes all the way through, away from the vines, away from the roots, because too much water is bad for the vine. But if the soil is so bad that there's very little nutrient, then we're going to have a problem producing quality fruit. So it needs a little bit of nutrient, but not too much. Definitely not the nutrient that we're going to find in the fields that the farmers use to grow vegetables and wheats and grains and stuff like that. Content of the soil is important as well. And again, let's go back to northern France. Again, we have limited days of sunshine because of how far north it is. So vineyards in northern France are going to be on those south-facing slopes. Ideally, maybe if there's a lake there to maximize. But if you can imagine now, if the soil in these areas, for example, in Champagne, which is one of the most northern wine growing regions in France, champ is actually French for chalk. So the soil of Champagne is very chalky or very white in color. And the vineyards that have maximum amount of this white soil produce some of the grapes, because not only, because in Champagne, all of the grapes are grown on south-facing slopes. It's too far north to be flat. It really needs to be on the south-facing slope. So the sunlight is coming directly into the slopes. And again, between the vines is this white chalky soil. So what happens is the sunlight hits this white chalky soil and then bounces back up into the vineyard. So the grapes, the leaves in the grapes are getting the sun directly from the sun, but it's also getting these refracted sunlight from this white chalky soil. Also, if you find vineyards that have lots of white pebbles, white stones, you're getting that same amount of refraction. So the sunlight hitting, reflecting up into the leaves is maximum compared to, say, a black soil. A black soil will just absorb the sunlight. It won't go anywhere. So if you're in an area that maybe gets lots and lots and lots of sunlight, maybe we don't want to have that chalky soil. It's going to create too much heat in the vineyard. So it's about balance. Okay. Now, another important aspect of terroir actually doesn't have anything to do with climate or soil or whether it's a slope or not. It has to do with tradition. It has to do with the winemaker. And this is where man comes into it, our women. So if we talk about traditional winemaking, for example, they make wine in a particular way in Champagne. They use particular grapes and they grow them on particular areas of the area of Champagne, hills, chalky soil, because they've been making wine there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they've just kind of figured it out. It just works better. This particular grape, maybe they had lots of different kinds of grape varieties, but the grape varieties for Champagne, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, they actually like cooler climate. They don't need as much sunlight as some of the other grape varieties. For example, Cabernet Sauvignon is the main grape of Bordeaux, which is in southern part of France. It needs a lot of sunlight. In Bordeaux, there is no Pinot Noir and no Chardonnay because it's too warm. In Burgundy and Champagne, there's no Cabernet because it doesn't have enough sunlight. It doesn't have enough of that. So these particular, the tradition of growing wines a particular way are done so because for hundreds of years they've been practicing trial and error and they figured out what grapes work better. In the new world, what happens now is the winemaker says, okay, we've got the right amount of sunshine and the yields in say California, Napa Valley, but now let's look at what grapes are best for that. And they'll look to, they know that Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir They like a cooler climate. So there's certain areas of California they won't do it. But this is where the winemaker will make the decisions on the grape varieties that he's going to use, and that's then going to affect the final result in the wine, what it's going to taste like, what it's going to feel like. Okay, but it all is going to reflect back to terrain, soil, climate, because there's certain grapes that work in certain soils, certain climates, and certain terrains. So that's what we want to do. So let's just refresh a bit about the different aspects of terroir. Too cold, we're not going to get our grapes ripened. They're just not going to produce. Too hot, they're either not going to start photosynthesis or they're going to create too much sugar right away, and we're not going to get the complex flavors that we want to get. Wind is actually a really, really important aspect in two ways. Wind is beneficial to grapes. One, if we're in a hot climate and we're near a large body of water, we get these cool breezes coming off that, and that cools down the temperature so it's not too hot. Grapes will produce better. But wind is also very good for keeping the health of the vine, of the vineyard. Because one of the biggest problems we have in growing grapes is we get certain diseases, molds and fungus that will attack the grapes and kill the grapes and make very, very bad grapes. But for example, in Kolkata, when it's monsoon season, in the morning, we wake up, we open all the windows. And I think this is all around India. We open up all the windows because we want the breeze to come through the house to keep it fresh and to keep the humidity level down. Because if you keep all the windows closed, you start to get humidity build up in the apartment. And I used to get mold and stuff, black stuff growing on my ceilings in my flat in Kolkata. So the vineyard is the same way. If it has these breezes that come through the vineyard, it helps to dry them out. It lowers the humidity and the damp, and it just makes for a healthier vineyard. Better grapes. There's a lot less disease and other conditions that can damage the vines. Fog is a very, very important part, especially when we're talking about our California Chardonnay. This particular one is coming from Napa Valley. And Napa Valley is inland in California, in what can be a very hot area, almost too hot for some quality vines. But there's something very, very special that happens in Napa. And that is almost every night. And I've been driving from Napa Valley back to San Francisco. It's about a 100-mile, 150-mile drive. And as you drive towards San Francisco from Napa Valley, you start to see the hills in front of you, which you have to cross before you get into San Francisco. And there's this huge clouds of fog coming over the hill, and it's coming into the valley. Every night this happens. Comes from the sea into the valley, and it puts a blanket of fog over top of the vineyard. And in the early morning, when the sun starts to come up, which in some areas that are further in where you're not getting this fog, they're already starting to warm up. And by the afternoon, it's extremely hot, too hot for quality grapes. But in Napa, because this fog layer is there, it protects the grapes from this initial sunlight in the very early morning and into the mid-morning. It starts to burn off around 11 o'clock, and then the vineyard starts to heat up, and it gets to a really nice warmth that the grapes like, and it produces very good quality grapes. If it didn't have this fog that acted as a protection against the initial heat, the vineyard would become too warm. But it has this fog, and it actually is very unique to this particular area, and it just produces extremely high quality because of that. And it's just because that's one of the aspects of terroir that is beneficial to this particular vineyard. Again, north and south facing, very important, maximizes sunlight, allows for drainage, slopes are great. Elevation, hot climate, higher elevation is better. Hot countries, it's a cooler at a higher elevation. And again, if we were in a cool climate, very far north, we wouldn't be planting up in the hills, up in the mountains. We would want to be down lower, more in the lower elevation where we're going to have much better warmth. Again, the kind of soil we have, not too fertile, good drainage. If we're in an area that doesn't have maximum sunlight, if we've got refraction, white soils, light colored soils, this is great to give additional sunlight into the canopy for the photosynthesis, producing the sugar, ripening the grapes. Density of soil, loose soil, gravel, sand is great for drainage. If you are in an area where it does rain a lot, by having gravel, the water will come, but it'll drain away and it'll stay away from the vine. So the vine is happier there. And then again, techniques, winemaking, tradition, what grapes are planted, how they take care of the vineyard. These are all very, very important components that will make a difference in the quality of the wine. Okay, so let's compare now a little more closely these two wines. And I wish if I was there, we could taste them. But you can't taste them, but I can taste them, and I'll tell you what we're going to get here. So it's the same. It's all Y plus S plus Y equals alcohol and CO2. The process is exactly the same. All wine is made the same way. Fermentation, yeast eats the sugar, creates it. These are both using the same grape variety. And grape variety also is very unique in how a wine is going to taste. Because just like mangoes, all mangoes taste different, right? Some dramatically different in their flavors because the variety of the mango, the species of the mango is different. Same with grapes, but we're using the same grape. But we're going to get two very different wines, both in how the wine looks, smells, and tastes because of the effects of the different terroir in the different areas. So, Burgundy, this is very, very far north in France, and we looked at the big map. So the days of sunlight are less. Montrachet is down here, which is actually a little bit more south than Chablis. Chablis also produces a Chardonnay, but it's also different because it is quite a bit even more north. Almost, again, all of the best vineyards in Burgundy are on slopes, south-facing slopes, maximizing the sunlight. Again, Burgundy up here, very close to 50 degrees. And then Napa, quite low, about 30 degrees. Napa, as you see, is here. This is California. Here is San Francisco, and Napa is here. This is the Napa Valley, and it is far enough in that it's not getting the very cool, because San Francisco and close to the coast is very cool. That is a very, very cool area. There can be, you can be in San Francisco and it can be about 17 degrees Celsius. You go into Napa, it's 30 degrees Celsius. You can see a big swing in that because it's so close to the ocean. So as we get in, it starts to warm up a bit more. So the average temperature in Napa Valley is significantly higher than it is in Burgundy. But if we were to go beyond Napa into the Central Valley, which is further in, it's very, very hot. Quality of the grapes there and the quality of the wine there is produced is significantly lower. Napa, again, because of this fog, this influence of the cooling effect of the fog, gives that actually that really nice, perfect balance of not too hot, not too cool, just right, produces a really nice wine. But it's warmer than Burgundy. So when we drink the Burgundy Chardonnay, we're going to get more citrus flavors, like pears, citrus, lemon, apple. But if we're drinking the warmer climate Chardonnay, we're going to be getting more riper flavors, more tropical fruit flavors like pineapple and mango. And you'll actually see this is a little bit of the California, and it's actually quite golden in color. And if we were to open the Montrachet, it would actually be more pale in color, because that additional heat will also make the juice and the wine more golden in color. So we can actually look at the two wines side by side, and we can tell which one is a cool climate because it's a paler, more lemon greenish color, and a hot climate Chardonnay is going to be more golden in color. So the different terroir is also going to affect visually how the wine is going to look. On the nose, on the aromas, a hot climate wine is going to be much more ripe and tropical in aroma, and it's also going to have higher alcohol because it has more sugar, more sunlight, more heat, more sugar. The alcohol content of the California is about 14.5%. The alcohol content of the Burgundy is about 13.5%. And that's enough to be able to physically notice the difference in alcohol. So that is what these different effects of terroir have on a wine. They're both beautiful wines. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're just different. And it just comes down to a matter of personal preference. The Montrachet is going to be more mineral, again, more citrus flavors, not as ripe in flavor, not as robust, where the California one is definitely going to be more riper in flavor. So it's a matter of what people like. Some people prefer a more elegant, lighter style wine, which is the Montrachet or Burgundy, for example, than a hot climate Chardonnay. So it's just a matter of preference, but it's all to do with the effects of terroir. So where grapes are grown around the world, and all of these different effects that we get in the vineyard are what dictates really style and quality and characteristics of the wine. Okay, so I wish you were all here to be able to try some of the Chardonnay, but maybe next time we can do something. So do we have any questions from any of the students?
Yes, Mr. Edgar, we got a lot of questions actually, and we will, from each campus, we'll ask one. So maybe I will start from Bangalore campus. One of my students is asking, sir, is the soil naturally aerated in the grape producing areas, or we mix something with the soil?
We do. And again, depending on the kind of soil, some soils are more naturally aerated than others. But again, if we talk about, and it's something the students can do, if you look up biodynamic wines, and biodynamic is kind of like organic, but it's taken to a little more of a holistic approach to the soil. But one of their main focus is on the health of the soil. They want to have a healthy soil that it's in balance. And what really makes the soil naturally aerated is the little tiny worms and the little bugs that go in there that dig their little holes, and they move the soil around. So by having a healthy soil that has lots of animal life in it, means it's a healthier soil. So yes, you can do certain things that will make the soil healthier, but do a little research on biodynamic and you'll find out about soil health and the things that they do to help that. But yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you, sir. I would request Ms. Sonia to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. The students of Delhi are asking a lot of questions. So one of the question is, sir, do pesticides affect the taste and health of the grape? And if, then how? Pesticides.
Yeah, well, pesticides, as you know, they kill things. They're poisons. So, and again, that's where organic comes in versus using pesticides or not. And pesticides themselves I think don't really change the flavor of the wine, because typically pesticides are given well in advance of the grapes being picked. So that sort of, and again, if you've ever been around when someone is spraying pesticide, you can smell it. But when the grapes are picked, the pesticides, if it's a non-organic vineyard, the pesticides have been done long, long time before. So you don't get flavor differences in the grape, but you do get component differences in the wine, because these pesticides, they leave a chemical trace on the grapes. So even though it's been a while since it's been applied, it's still there. So the chemicals that are used don't disappear completely. They stay there on the grape. So when you're making the wine, you're keeping the grapes and you're pressing them. So you're getting these chemicals that can come into the wine. So it's not so much you can taste them, but they're definitely not good to have all of those chemicals coming into your body. And that's where organic wines are the production of grapes without using these chemicals. There's other things that you can do to protect the vine against animals and pests and whatever, and certain diseases. But yeah, but that's another bigger conversation that we can't really get into right now. But yeah, it's definitely not good to have a lot of chemicals on food in general.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, I will take up the next question. Good morning, sir, and everyone else.
Morning.
The students in Ahmedabad, there are a couple of students asking the same question, so I'll first take this question up. As sir has area where grapes are grown favorably, but in India, the grapes are grown well in Nasik, which is outside this area. So how grapes are grown so well in those areas?
Again, if we look at Nasik, the elevation is there. So it's a little bit cooler because of the elevation. But also in India, we make wine kind of in a sneaky way. Because in most of the Northern Hemisphere, the season is from the spring, which is like April, to the fall, which is like September, October. So it's cooler, it warms up, and then it starts to cool down. So we need to pick the grapes before it gets too cold. In India, we start in the fall and we continue until the spring. So we're not doing anything during the summertime where it's too hot and also too wet because of the monsoons. So the reason why we can do wine in India is because of that reverse cycle, because India has a 12-month growing season because it is warm enough 12 months of the year. So that is why we can do it in India. It's a little bit about the different areas of India because it is a little bit higher in elevation, so it is a little bit cooler. Bangalore as well is a lot more moderate compared to some of the other places. For example, now I'm talking to people in Bangalore and the weather's quite lovely, where in Jaipur, I'm sure it's getting kind of hot. So that is kind of how we do it in India.
Thank you. Abhishek sir, if you have a question, you can take a question. If not, we will move to Saurav sir.
I will ask. I have one question.
Yep.
Good morning.
Morning.
Am I audible?
Yep. Can hear you.
So,
Very
yes.
faint.
Okay. So there is a question from Bangalore campus. So the students are asking that what will be the characteristics of a wine or a grape which is grown in a nutritional or a rich soil? What will be the characteristic of the grape?
It's not so much the characteristic of the grape from a nutritional soil. The high nutritional soil affects the entire vine. And what happens is when the nutritional is very high, the plant's actually quite happy because it's growing, but it grows vines and it grows shoots and it grows leaves. It doesn't really focus on the grapes as much. So that's why a less nutritional soil will grow enough leaves to be able to do photosynthesis, but it's not going to make the plant go too crazy that it's just growing and growing and growing. So it grows enough to have enough leaves for photosynthesis, so the whole thing works for the grapes. But yeah, so that's kind of why. But you will not see grapes. You will see, it's always bad soil, a less fertile soil that we plant grapes on. And again, you can't plant tomatoes in gravel because it needs more nutrient. It just depends on the kind of plant that it is. Grapes require less nutrient. Vegetables require a higher nutrient. So it's not so much the effect of the flavor of the grape, it's just how the vine produces grapes and how the vine grows.
Thank you, Mr. Keith.
Yeah.
The next question from the Delhi campus is that what terroir will be good to have a water content of 50% as well as for the sugar?
Say that again, sorry. Which terroir? Again, everything the terroir influences will depend on where the vineyard is. What we're trying to do is to get that happy balance. Not too hot, not too cool, enough sunlight to be able to ripen the grapes all the way. So terroir influences are beneficial in certain areas, like elevation is beneficial in a hot climate. It's not beneficial in a cool climate. A south-facing slope is very beneficial in a northern vineyard in France where it's cooler, less sunlight, but it's not beneficial in southern France where it's already very hot and lots of sunshine. So you can't choose a terroir for grapes. You have to take into account what is the vineyard influences the other aspects of the terroir before you do this. So it's really a balance of many things. It's the balance of the soil, the climate, the terroir, and the tradition. They all kind of have to be in sync.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question from IIHM Jaipur. Students are asking this common question. Sir, can we grow two different types of grapes in one vineyard if somebody wished to?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you can, if you've got one big vineyard, you can have each row has a different grape. But again, you have to understand that the vineyard is going to be having its own sort of unique set of elements of terroir. And if it's a cool climate, then there's only particular grapes that will do well there. And again, you know, Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc, these grapes like cooler climates, where Shiraz and Cabernet, they like a warmer climate. So you probably wouldn't see the same vineyard that had Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, and then maybe Chardonnay. You would have, hopefully, grapes that were suited for that particular vineyard.
Got it, Mr. Edgar.
Yeah. And you can also do, which is one of the interesting things about grapes, the vine itself, it's really miraculous how the vine works. You can actually take one plant and cut it off and graft on top of the roots a completely different grape variety, and it will grow. So it's quite easy. You can actually change an entire vineyard from one grape to another very fast without having to, because again, it takes about 3 to 5 years from a small plant to be able to produce quality grapes. But by keeping the existing rootstock and just grafting on a different top, you can change it rather fast.
Right, sir. Thanks a lot. Over to anybody else? To Mr. Ma'am.
Yes, I have more or less covered one question that I had regarding terroir. So we can go to other campus. I don't have any question regarding terroir anymore.
I
We are
have a
waiting
question from Bangalore. Maybe I'll ask, from last question from Bangalore, I'll ask. One of my students is asking, sir, India is growing French grapes like Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, etc. But why Indian grapes are not so popular? Indian local grapes.
Because there's, and this is a good, something the students can do when they're finished, when they have some time, to look up Vitis vinifera and Vitis lubrusca. There's two completely different kinds of grapes. Vitis vinifera is the Cabernet, the Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir. All of those are wine grapes. Vitis lubrusca are food grapes, table grapes. So all of the native grapes of India are Vitis lubrusca. And Vitis lubrusca are great to eat, and they make very big grapes and they're very tasty. But when you do fermentation of them and try to make wine out of them, they give a kind of a foxy, kind of a funky flavor. And it's really just because of the genus species. It's just a slightly different kind of grape. So it just doesn't taste as good as the Vitis vinifera. So Vitis lubrusca, the table grapes, and the grapes of India. They just don't ferment into something that tastes very nice. Where Vitis vinifera does. Good question though.
Thank you so much, sir. I learned this today. Thank you.
Can I take one question that I've got at the last minute? Is can we grow wine in wine grapes in greenhouse?
Yeah, of course. If you need, but the thing is, you need to, a greenhouse will help to adjust that. So for example, if you are in an area where it's too cool, in a greenhouse, typically when we grow something in a greenhouse is because if we didn't have the greenhouse to warm everything up, it's too cool for any plant to grow. So yes, in a cool climate, you could do that. But the thing is, you need a fair amount of grapes to make wine. So you need to have a really, really, really big greenhouse. And the costs is maybe not there. Where tomatoes, for example, you can grow a lot of tomatoes, lovely, and you can get quite a nice return on the tomatoes. Where you need a fair amount of grape to kind of make it make sense. So yeah, I think it's more of a cost effect. It would just be easier to grow grapes somewhere where it was a little bit warmer.
Thank you so much.
No
one last question from Delhi campus. Napa Valley has diverse soil culture with 6 of the world's 12 soil orders and 33 soil series. How do vineyards thrive in mountain regions? From Griffin.
From Griffin?
The name of the student who is asking the question.
Oh, from Griffin. Okay.
Yeah.
I kind of get what he's getting from. So how does it? Because is he talking because mountains, the mountainous areas of Napa?
Yes, he's talking about that. Yes.
Well, again, there's lots of different kinds of soils, and certain soils are better for certain grape varieties. But again, grapes just sort of like these natural draining soils. There are some vineyards that grow very, very high up in the mountains in Napa Valley around the edge. Elevation is higher, so it's a little bit cooler there. So it depends on the grape variety you're trying to grow there. But again, these mountains tend to be south facing. So even though they're quite a bit cooler because they're higher in the mountain, they are south facing. So it's kind of a technical question, and I don't quite understand the whole thing. So I don't know whether I answered that or not. But it's a good Google question for him to do. And I think Griffin's been Googling because that was a pretty detailed question.
Thank you so much.
Which is good. Google away. There's lots of things to learn online.
Thank you, Mr. Keith.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edgar. As I can see, the time is already crossed. So maybe the next question we can take it with maybe the next classes. And today, I think we can end the class over here, sir.
Super.
Okay, thank you so
very
much for
everybody.
joining, sir. It was nice to hear from you, sir.
Yeah, and Peter will be, I think, next for you, and then I'm going to be after a week or so. Great. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.